I will turn it over to Dr. Thomas Sharkey and Dr. Bryan Miller, both of Clemson University, with Understanding and Disrupting the Formation of New Criminal Networks, the case of novel illicit drug trafficking operations. Please take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Brooke. Can you see the slides well?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much for the introduction. In addition to Bryan and myself, we have a really fantastic team of undergrads, masters, and PhD students working with us in both industrial engineering and criminal justice. We'll provide some shout outs to their contributions throughout this talk, but we've been really fortunate to fund a really great collection of students. And we're really excited that you've taken the time out of your day to hear kind of where our project stands, what we've accomplished in 2024, and where we're kind of going in 2025. So a kind of brief agenda, we're going to provide kind of a quick introduction to the research challenge and our project, along with our technical approach. And we're going to spend a lot of time discussing our results, especially what we found through interviews and focus groups with law enforcement across the state of South Carolina on essentially how drug trafficking networks are currently structured, how recent novel illicit opioids, specifically fentanyl, those trafficking networks have formed, and how we're kind of using the data from those qualitative interviews and creating themes and typologies that will allow us to create synthetic but realistic network data. And then we'll kind of open it up for questions at the end. So our project, the research challenge we're trying to address with our project is that kind of established criminal networks are often quite resilient and may be difficult to disrupt. So we've been brainstorming ways to think about disrupting the emergence of new criminal networks or criminal networks entering a new market. So we're really using kind of the emergence of fentanyl over the past 5 to 7, 10 years as a really good case study for how quickly these networks have formed around fentanyl trafficking. So our research goals are to understand how fentanyl trafficking networks have formed across different geographic scales. So we're going to talk about the fact that we've interviewed law enforcement agencies operating at county levels across South Carolina, then kind of state level. So we've kind of built up knowledge, and now we're kind of at the point where we're looking at kind of how does the South Carolina drug trafficking network interact with the broader drug trafficking networks across the country. And then we really are interested in creating analytics based on the knowledge that we've obtained through our interviews to disrupt the formation. And hopefully kind of the idea of we're disrupting the formation of these networks, it becomes more difficult for them to really establish effective operations in new markets or new areas. Overall, what we've kind of thought about or brainstormed heading into the project was that with the emergence of fentanyl, with the emergence of the dark web, there may have been a shift in kind of traditional drug trafficking supply chains. So in this particular picture on the right, we kind of see a very traditional hierarchical drug trafficking network where a wholesaler may purchase drugs directly from a supplier. On the left, we see maybe kind of an emerging distribution network where there are people at lower levels of the distribution network that are accessing the supplier directly, for example, through the dark web. So our research approach, we've been doing these interviews and focus groups with various law enforcement agencies to understand how fentanyl networks are structured and how they formed. We are in the process of converting kind of the qualitative outputs and qualitative insights into data and algorithms. And we're hoping to be able to test some of the analytics that we've created on realistic data to understand how our interdictions kind of alter the formation of the network. So our impact, we're hoping to have analytics kind of driven through stakeholder engagement to disrupt the formation of fentanyl trafficking networks across various geographic scales. Our technical approach, we're merging Bryan's significant expertise in working with law enforcement, partnering with them through interviews and focus groups to identify key themes, along with my past work on disrupting illicit networks And then we're kind of meeting in the middle in terms of ensuring the data that this project is created, especially with respect to the quantitative side, is realistic and modern. So within the academic communities, a lot of the analytics that have been tested on drug trafficking networks are on networks that were operational 10 to 15 years ago, including there's some examples of recent papers testing analytics on networks that operated in the mid 90s. So our idea is to really kind of try and make sure that we're producing data that is based on networks currently operating. So in terms of our results, we wanted to break down results into kind of 3 areas. So the first thing we're going to talk about is understanding network structure information. In addition to kind of the academic journal article, we've also have a 5-page briefing highlighting a lot of these results that some of you may have already received, but we can also kind of distribute after this meeting as well. And to kind of give a shout out to the students involved, Abby Curran, Adams Howard, and Nina Pinto participated in this project all as undergrads. We were fortunate to have Abby continue on as a research associate as well.
Everybody, please. Okay.
Got it. So I mean, again, just speaking to the fantastic team we have around us. So what we're doing in 2024 is we conducted qualitative interviews and focus groups with across 26 different drug enforcement units operating in 12 distinct kind of jurisdictions in the state of South Carolina. Our results that we're going to talk about today in the briefings are based on our analysis of these interviews. I will touch on a couple of the things that we've learned in 2025, showing our briefing 2 additional interviews, including the narcotics unit of the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, so our equivalent of state police, and various federal agents focusing their efforts on South Carolina trafficking, including DA, ATF, and HSI operating in kind of the upstate of South Carolina. So our process was we did these qualitative interviews. We focused on identifying common themes and typologies across various areas related to how the networks operate, how networks form. So we're going to kind of break our results down into a few key areas. So one of our key findings was how were drugs actually getting into South Carolina? Essentially, almost all drugs are coming through Mexico in some form. The purple lines here indicate that the transportation into South Carolina is via parcel delivery, so essentially through the mail. And then the orange lines and arcs are kind of indicating kind of more of the traditional vehicle transportation as well. So drugs often kind of stop at either Atlanta or Charlotte, depending on which area of South Carolina you're in. The coastal counties tend to get a little bit more supply from Charlotte, whereas the upstate and mid piece of the region tend to get more from Atlanta. Something that we've learned in recent interviews is Chicago is also a city of interest and kind of a major player in terms of supply into the state as well. We've also kind of explored pricing structures at various levels of drugs. An interesting finding here is that the closer you are to the source, the cheaper it is to purchase, kind of indicating that the prices do factor in some level of transportation costs into that incurred by the trafficker. With respect to these prices, an update to them is that the cocaine lower bound range the lower bound needs to increase. It's probably more like 16 to 18,000 to 26,000. We also included smaller quantities, especially a point of fentanyl, because many fentanyl users are not capable of purchasing a gram at a time. So they're kind of purchasing what they can afford at each point. Similar to pricing, we looked at themes related to kind of use and potency. Here, one thing that emerged was meth is still a major concern in South Carolina. Typically, this meth is being produced out of the country as well. So that kind of represents a shift from what South Carolina law enforcement was observing 10 to 15 years ago with labs in the state. We also kind of focused on the potency of fentanyl, and an interesting finding that kind of correlates with the pricing is that the fentanyl is more potent the closer it is to the city of Atlanta or Charlotte, essentially indicating that the number of levels of people involved in moving fentanyl into South Carolina influences essentially how often it's getting cut and its potency being reduced. And then one thing that we found, especially in recent interviews, was an indication that in around 2020, 2021, fentanyl was being cut, whether intentional or unintentional, to a lot of drugs. That seems to be kind of trending off. And one hypothesis for this was the way the legislature has passed laws related to fentanyl, and that even drugs that are cut with fentanyl, the penalties that are being enforced are based on the overall weight of the drug. So if you had a kilo of cocaine and it had fentanyl in it, you're getting charged for having a kilo of fentanyl. Related to the network structure, one real important kind of characteristic that we wanted to identify is we're kind of characterizing the wholesaler as the person kind of that the drugs first flow through when they arrive into a county in South Carolina. And we're interested in how these wholesalers were connected to either gangs or cartels. And our kind of differentiation in this table is a connection indicates that the wholesaler was purchasing drugs from a member of a gang or a connection. The membership classification was that the wholesaler was actually a member of the gang or their cartel. And these findings kind of indicate that, especially from the cartel perspective, there are places where cartel members are actively involved at the wholesaler and county level, but a lot of wholesalers are obtaining drugs from cartel members, typically, again, outside the state in the cities of Atlanta or Charlotte. And then we looked at kind of from the wholesaler, how do the drugs flow through various other dealers and people before arriving at kind of a user. So we typically have found across our counties somewhere between 5 and 7 levels between the wholesaler and use. For smaller counties, this tends to be a little bit more collapsed, so 3 to 4 levels. We found that there are a lot of people trafficking in fentanyl and meth that also are using it. Typically, these people are dealing to support their use. And what's really important here is the data and numbers that we're gathering with respect to the county level network structures are forming the basis for how we're going about creating synthetic data as well. So this is a really good point to kind of transition to how we're taking the themes and typologies that we just kind of reviewed and our key findings and converting it to network data that can be used by kind of the analytics community. So I'm going to talk about work of the team, but kind of with respect to citation. An undergrad industrial engineer has put together kind of a project paper on taking kind of the themes and typologies and creating this quantitative data. So the way we've been approaching this is we're taking the work that we've done qualitatively and looking for the key themes findings and analysis, and then using that data to produce kind of an initial attempt at network data. So we have kind of a process that will create this network data according to certain rules. Not every network that we create is exactly the same, so it gives us ability to kind of look at various what if scenarios. And then from there, we're currently kind of reviewing with our qualitative team and qualitative sources what looks right about these networks that we're creating and what looks wrong. And then what we'll walk through is we'll kind of change the characteristics of the way we're producing these networks and kind of continue this process until we essentially kind of converge to a procedure to generate networks that look realistic, that there's not as much critique with respect to the validation process. So I want to highlight where we currently are as of March 2025. We have our initial attempt at network data. I'll walk you through some of the examples that we're capable and some of the analysis we're capable of doing, but we are going to improve that. So we're in the process of validating with the qualitative data as well. So given the focus, given how prevalent meth was with respect to distribution networks, we have produced networks that are capable of kind of trafficking both meth and fentanyl. This is an example of a smaller county level distribution network where we only have essentially 4 levels total, so kind of 3 levels after the wholesaler. Through this, we can do some initial visualizations. So one visualization we can do is look at all the different ways drugs can flow to a particular person. So in this case, we've highlighted all of the pathways to a particular user. We can kind of see that this particular user is obtaining drugs from multiple street level dealers that are both, those street level dealers are connected to both mid-level dealers operating in this particular network as well. So this kind of offers a little bit of thinking of the impact on this particular user. If we were able to remove one dealer, they would still be able to access through this network meth and fentanyl as well. Diving a little bit deeper, we're also interested in not only the connections between people, but also how much people are capable of trafficking. This particular data here is looking at their capacity or how much drugs are flowing through them on kind of a biweekly basis, so anywhere from 10 to 14 days. Our use category, so the red nodes at the bottom, we do consider situations where people are polydrug users, so they're using both meth and fentanyl, and situations where they only use one of those drugs as well. And in terms of kind of like showing you all how our validation process is going, when we presented this type of data to our team and then kind of reviewed our qualitative notes in recent interviews, you'll notice that the capacities of the MD nodes, the mid-level dealer nodes, are pretty close together. And we've learned that that's not often the case. Typically, the wholesaler will provide more drugs to people that can move more drugs. So we really need to factor that into our calculations as well. So that's an example of for the next round of the network generation techniques, we will be looking much more at how are certain dealers connected downstream to demand points and factoring that into how the wholesaler is distributing their supply to various people. And then I wanted to touch briefly on our analytics that we're creating. We have tested these analytics on old data, so they work well from a computational perspective, but we'll hold off on presenting analysis on how, kind of disruption analysis until we test them on our realistic modern day networks as well. So just want to give you a high level overview of what the analytics are capable of doing. So our analytical approach falls into this class of industrial engineering problems called interdiction modeling. What interdiction models do is they kind of plan out where we can disrupt networks. And one thing that the models that we're working with are able to do is they factor in how the network is going to reform or restructure after disruption. So in this particular example, we removed node 3 or criminal 3, and criminal 1 kind of connects down to criminal 5. Alternatively, if we're disrupting someone that may be in an emerging network, may be using kind of the dark web to access supply, the network may not restructure in a similar direct way or replacement way because the people that A was connected to don't know how to access the supply in the same way as A did. So they're kind of right now, immediately after this disruption, without supply. So the approach that we are implementing is we are building out, trying to predict how the network is going to reform or restructure after a certain interdiction option. So the dashed kind of dark blue purple lines that now appear between 1 and 4, 1 and 5, 2 and 5, and 4 and 5 are options that we believe could occur in terms of the network reorganizing or restructuring itself after removing 3. So what our models specifically account for is the fact that the exact restructuring is unknown to the person planning the disruption. And we have various kind of scenarios that could occur after implementing a particular interdiction option. So this particular example is what happens if 1 establishes a direct connection to 5. We could also look at options when 2 establishes a direct connection to 5 as well. So now 2 is kind of responsible for both supplying to 4 and 5. And then this particular example could be that 1 connects directly to 4, and essentially 4 is promoted to also offering supply to 5. So ultimately, kind of where we are from a analytics or mathematics perspective is we have the capability of planning out interdictions when we recognize that sometimes interdictions may not always be successful. So we may not always be able to remove the person that we are planning to. If we are successful, this triggers restructurings that we kind of understand the likelihood of occurring, but we don't know exactly which one is going to implement. And then after the network kind of repairs itself or restructures itself, it goes back to trafficking. And what we're seeking to do is kind of disrupt the expected performance of the network after the restructuring occurs. So that kind of concludes our results piece of this talk. One question that we have for the audience to think about and that we'd love help on is we've talked to federal agents, federal TFOs across South Carolina. Are there connections that we should be thinking about in terms of expanding our law enforcement interviews both inside and outside of South Carolina? We've been really fortunate to be introduced, kind of each person we interview is very willing to introduce us to new people, but we're also kind of want people's opinions on if we're missing certain partnerships or agencies as well. So I'll pause there and open it up for questions.
Great, Tom. Thank you very much for a really interesting and tight presentation. We're thrilled with the work that you've done in this project. I'm going to open it up to the audience for questions now. Please feel free to put your questions in the chat, and I will monitor it for Tom and Bryan and read it off so they don't have to monitor. And I'll kick it off with a question. So, Tom, the method of shipment, that is vehicle versus parcel, how does that impact trafficking networks?
So what we've kind of been understanding is that the parcel delivery seems to be for wholesalers that are operating on a bit of a smaller level. So you're not necessarily getting quite as much supply when it's coming through a parcel, which makes sense because there's only so much you can ship. Um, so that's kind of one of the major kind of findings, and related to that, parcel supply tends to be coordinated through um, online sources, whether it be the dark web or kind of an open website as well.
Understood.
One thing I can kind of
Okay.
add to that as well is it does seem like it's not mutually exclusive and that some wholesalers will obtain supply through multiple methods.
Great. We welcome any questions in the chat. Looks like we have it looks like we have 51 folks. That's a really nice big number, but happy to take oh, here's one. Jonathan Jones asks, is there any correlation between the amount of fentanyl and the source or the method of transport?
Bryan, do you want to take that, or I can?
Yeah, I can go ahead and answer that. Typically, in the amount of fentanyl that's being moved to a wholesaler, this might be different at a supplier level. They can move about the same amount through a parcel versus, through trafficking, vehicle trafficking. So I don't think it makes as much different at a wholesaler level. When we're talking back to the source cities and at a supplier level, I think that might matter more, but we haven't gotten to that point with our county level and state level interviews.
I think related to this, one thing we found that's occurred in a few different counties is kind of this recognition that the wholesalers will split up their shipments and activities from their supply. So they won't send a single person to Atlanta. They'll split it up across 3 or 4 people as well. And we've also found that oftentimes wholesalers will be fronted additional drugs beyond what they want to purchase. So to kind of establish a little bit of a dependency as well.
Okay, Jason Ackelson from S&T asks, is there any theoretical basis or empirical findings about network reconstitution based on the type of node, for example, wholesaler versus money launderer, that is removed from the system?
So we're starting to ask those questions. And we've had some conversations that certainly kind of like the level of node is going to influence how quickly a replacement or a restructuring happens. So kind of a lower level person is often going to be very quickly replaced, typically through kind of the network or social network of the people above them. And I think that, I don't know, I think, Bryan, there's a few other aspects to this too.
Yeah, I think one of the things we're finding is there's definitely a trust to time kind of ratio. So as individuals move up in the network, getting that higher level trust takes a portion of time, and we're trying to factor that into the restructuring. So if you move someone up who's a high trust individual, how long does it take for the next person moving in to gain that trust to get up to that kind of level?
And I think
Thanks.
one additional thought in this direction is we have asked, like, when you've done a big interdiction or big bust, how long does it seem before prices restabilize? So typically prices would increase temporarily, indicating that supply into the area is decreased. And we've heard ranges from like 1 day to a month. A lot of the county levels seem to indicate somewhere between 2 to 4 weeks of instability.
Hey, we have a question from William Hubbard. Your study was focused on South Carolina. Did your data include outliers for drug distribution in high tourism areas such as Myrtle Beach? And how did this affect your study?
I can take this one. Yeah, we did interviews in tourism areas, and one of the things that we found was at the dealer level, they were doing very, very high levels of activity. So in one case, I think they had a street level dealer where over 100 vehicles were coming by in a day. Just showing the level of purchasing that was happening at the lower levels. And that's not something that we were seeing necessarily in other counties and other areas. So it seems just like the volume of users to street level dealers seems to be increased in those tourism areas.
Great. Still happy to take any questions from the chat. I'll ask one in the meantime. Tell us a bit more about the dark web and the role of the dark web.
So, and Bryan probably has additional thoughts from the qualitative perspective. We are kind of seeing that those who it takes a lot of skills to access the dark web. So those who are using the dark web for supply are more difficult to replace. But I think we're also kind of getting an indication that at least in our initial round of interviews, so kind of more at the wholesaler level in counties, that it just seems easier for them to access the supplies out of Atlanta and Charlotte. So kind of the more traditional network. So I think that it's the use of the dark web is much more localized to small quantities or personal use as well. But Bryan, you may have additional thoughts.
Yeah, that's what I would just stress there. It seems like at the higher volume levels, it seems like it's not as active on the dark web as you're seeing, users or mid-level access. So those big player wholesalers, it seems like they're mostly getting from source cities.
Good. Great. Welcome any questions from the chat. We still have 48 folks on the line. Okay, I'll ask another question. What are some of the potential uses of the synthetic network data?
So I think besides kind of being able to test analytics on more modern day networks, something that Bryan and I have been talking a lot about is using them for what's kind of called conjoint analysis. So it's a fancy way of saying like the eye doctor test. Like we could show two networks and say which one looks more realistic, A or B, and then if it's B, what's more realistic, B or C. And one idea that we've really are interested in exploring kind of goes back to a earlier question on exploring how the networks may be restructured on a very operational level. So if we do remove a mid-level dealer, what do we believe are possible options for how things are restructured? And I think that would allow us to really get into a theme around the trust. Like we've talked about it, but not to the point where it's been rigorously kind of evaluated. So I think there's a lot of cool uses, and especially if we continue with the partnerships that we've established. I mean, we're showing them data based on the initial interviews and their initial expertise. So it should be hopefully very productive because it's data that they will be familiar with or is based on their knowledge.
Great, thanks. We have a question from Patricia Wolfhope. Have you thought about what it would take and the benefit of expanding this study to a national level, international level? Also, have you looked at other computer models that show the consequences of interdiction?
So I will take the latter, the second first, because that's more of my area. And we brainstormed other options. We are a lot of the interdiction modeling that's been done to date hasn't focused in the restructuring aspects. So we are kind of working with very recent developments in that area. But if you have specific examples of additional modeling that would be of interest to capture restructuring, I'd be really interested in hearing them. And then Bryan, dream big in terms of what.
Yeah, I think it would be. I think it would be great to expand this out. I think that there's some principles that we're kind of establishing, especially as the networks look different the farther you get away from a source city, and then there are other factors unique to South Carolina, like tourist areas. But I would be interested to see how many of these principles would be the same in other regions of the country, and then expanding out to a national level. We're kind of getting up to the wholesaler and their source supplies. But obviously, past that level, it would be interesting to figure out internationally how those drugs are getting to Atlanta in the first place or getting to Charlotte.
Great, and we would, CINA is, very proud to have supported this work. We do have a contract vehicle to continue projects. Great. I see Narcologic funded by NSF is the suggestion for Patricia. So CINA is proud to support this work, and we have a funding vehicle, a contract vehicle that could permit components to support this work going forward. If your component is in a position to support the work on a contract basis, we would love to talk to you.
Awesome. And just to comment on Narcologic, I think that would be really interesting to couple with the work that we're doing, because Narcologic works extremely well to understand how transnational disruptions, if I'm remembering the Narcologic correct, it does really well on how transnational disruptions spread trafficking across different areas. So it could be really cool to see how a simultaneous kind of national level disruption and kind of more the state level disruptions would connect to one another. So thank you for that.
Absolutely, Thomas. I agree with you 100%.
Thanks, Patricia. Great. Welcome. Any other questions? Great. If there are no other questions, I think we'll wrap it up. Thank you very much, Thomas and Bryan, for your illuminating presentation today and for all your good work with CINA on this project. Like I said at the beginning, we welcome interest from the components. We'd be happy to set up a bespoke briefing to go deeper into any of what you heard about here today. Reminder, this is already your research, and we want to put it in your hands. We're also eager to talk about ways to continue it into the future. So feel free to get in touch with us. Best way is through our website, cina.gmu.edu. Either I or our transition impact manager will be back in touch with you to set this up. And other than that, I will let our speakers go with best wishes, and thanks to everybody who tuned in today. All the best.
Thank you, everyone.